Welcome to the latest edition of our Election Science Office Hours, which is a webinar and podcast hosted by the Caltech Lynn Center for Science, Society, and Policy here at Caltech and moderated by me, Michael Alvarez. You can find the full archive of well over a dozen episodes now available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And they're on our Caltech Election Integrity Project website at protectingtheelection.us. Make sure to follow us on social media. We're on LinkedIn, X, and Blue Sky for the latest updates on our work. Today, our guest is Professor and Doctor, of course, Betsy Sinclair, who is the Assistant Vice Provost of Digital Transformations at Washington University in St. Louis. And she is joining us today to talk about AI and governance in elections. Good morning, Betsy, and thanks for joining us.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
So I've known Betsy for a very long time. I think it dates probably both of us. It's been a long time. We both have a few gray hairs since the first time we met. She originally came to Caltech to get her master's and PhD. And it's super exciting and a real honor for me to have Betsy, a former student, but also a close colleague, collaborator, and friend to this day on our office hours today. So in addition to being the Assistant Vice Provost of Digital Transformations at WashU, Betsy's the Thomas F. Eagleton University Professor of Public Affairs and Political Science and the Chair of the Political Science Department. And if you are all sitting here thinking she has at least 3 jobs, the answer is yes. Her research interests and teaching interests include American politics and political methodology, where she focuses on individual political behavior. And a lot of Betsy's work focuses on the social foundations of participatory democracy, the ways in which networks and how we're connected with each other as humans and individuals can influence voting, donating, voting for a candidate, or identifying with a particular party. So again, Betsy, thanks for being here today.
My pleasure.
So first off, I think everybody is curious about your really exciting new title and your new role, and congratulations on the new job. Assistant Vice Provost of Digital Transformation. So can you tell us first off, what an Assistant Vice Provost does? And second of all, what exactly is your remit? What does your job entail, this new position?
Well, when I first was appointed into this role, I actually went back and asked the vice provost for a different title. And I told her I had explained to my parents that I had been offered this role. And they said, it's very hard for people to understand what it is you actually do. My mother had suggested my title should be Data Witch, and my sister had pointed out that was a very gendered title, and I should instead ask for something gender neutral like Data Mage. And my brother, who himself is an academic, said maybe ask for something like, technology officer or AI officer. But it's the title for digital transformations comes out of our strategic plan, so there was no changing it. So the short version is, of course, my job is to support the provost. But the longer version of what I actually do is I help the university try to think really hard about our strategic choices, how we can allocate resources in terms of AI, in terms of data science, in terms of thinking about high performance computing, and how we can think about using our resources to really push ourselves into becoming the university of the future. And it's a really fun job, actually. I love that part of my day. I have a co-collaborator who's also an assistant vice provost named Nathan Jacobs, who's a professor of computer science. And the two of us together are really trying to lead this initiative to digitally transform a university. And I think, that used to mean more of a focus on data and data storage. And these days it means a lot of things to a number of different communities on campus. But it has been a good role for me to think about how it is that we can put people together and how we can put teams together and really get everyone on campus rowing in the same direction. It's a really fun.
Sounds like a great position and also a huge challenge, but at the same time, you're also doing your other duties. namely your research and teaching. And we'll talk about research in a bit, but what are you teaching these days?
Well, this most recent semester actually taught our required grad course on basically the introductory statistics course for our PhD students. I took that class from Bob Sherman at Caltech, or Dave Grether, depending upon which particular semester. Somewhat ironic, I was not a very strong student the first time I had to take those classes. So I'm pretty sympathetic to this current cohort of students. Um, I collaborated on a set of materials a long time ago with my little brother and another Caltech undergrad, who's now a professor at UC Berkeley, named Aaron Hartman. And so we have a pretty fierce set of materials now that really allows people to learn in this very integrated way. So the modality of learning is such that we give students worksheets at the start of class. It's like the opposite of technology. It's like right with a pencil and paper. You have until the end of class to complete your worksheet. And then the class goes like along for it, or I give like the first bit of the proof, and the students have to complete the second half, but it makes it a really engaged class. I won't teach that class again. The person who was on sabbatical this year will come back to teach it. And so next year I'm going to teach two classes, one on public opinion and American democracy, which is a pretty exciting class to teach these days. And the second is a class on origin stories, on origin stories of political candidates, and specifically how we can learn about the narrative structure of those origin stories and understand politics in America today.
Mhm. So how does this connect to the research that you do? So in your bio, you say that your work focuses on the social foundations of participatory democracy. Like I said earlier, the ways in which social networks influence voting, donating, choosing a candidate, or identifying with a political party. So what's your research in this area? And again, how does it connect back to what you're teaching?
Well, I've always been interested in measuring things. So I know that doesn't sound very exciting, but it actually, like, this is the deep magic of politics, is being able to look out into the world and capture something and say, I know this is actually true. I can make sense of the world around me. I can capture something and measure it. And so I think it's really interesting to try to think about doing that with respect to human behavior, because human beings are so very complicated and they interact all the time. And so it makes measuring really complicated. So in some of the work I've done with you, we've been thinking a lot about measurements of power in language and how you can see how patterns of language over time, because people are interacting, you can then infer back what you couldn't otherwise see, what would be latent. You can actually see influence, which gets, you can see those patterns emerging through language. Um, I think in a lot of ways, understanding uh, what makes us distinct, in terms of our ability as a species to govern ourselves, is a really interesting question that many of the things, these social foundations, tie us back to just like what it means to be a human being, which I think is a really interesting thing to think about in the age of AI, is like what makes us different, um,
Mhm.
and how do we understand um, how do we make sense of the political world? In
Mhm.
terms of the Origin Stories project, I think it's a pretty common human experience that everyone has had this chance to say, hey, tell me about yourself.
Mhm.
And how we answer that question is really different for time and place, but everyone's had that experience. You hear politicians tell stories like that over and over again, where they tell it the same way. They start in humble origins, they leave home to do great things, and they come back a champion of the people, the St. George, to battle a named dragon, whether or not those dragons are big government or big business, or even an opposing political candidate. And like any good fairy tale, oftentimes the story is a little bit amorphous, like will good or evil win? We don't know. But then there's a line that they have a spouse and a dog and two kids or something like that. And the story ends that way. And you might say, well, yes, just because that's the story format of how it is a politician, you think like, well, that's very strange. That's how we understand the political world. We hear those stories. You've never hired a dentist by asking them to tell them their origin story, or an accountant. Like, there's something very specific about how it is that we're thinking about government and how
Mhm.
we're asking people to narrate in this very specific way. And I think that's a lot of ways about how we understand this nature of representation. And so
Mhm.
that's where some of this comes in terms of like why I'm interested in those questions and how this relates to that very basic question about measurement.
Mhm. That's great because measurement is like, I think one of obviously we think alike. It's just one of those important things that as social scientists we struggle with. How do we measure these kinds of quantities? How do we measure these kinds of attitudes and opinions? And these origin stories, how do you go about not only just getting them from people, getting them to talk about it, but what's a measure for how, a different origin story arose or what its impact is on their political behavior. So just fascinating and innovative research. I want to pivot though for a sec. Because this does fit in with the theme of this conference that you and I organized back in January, and some of the work that we're continuing to do. Now, in January, we organized this conference called Information and Misinformation in Elections. And it was supposed to take place on campus at Caltech, but then the wildfires came along and devastated Southern California, including in the Pasadena area. Less than a week before the conference, we had to scramble to make decisions on the conference. And we, opted to move it online, which was a difficult decision, but the right one. And, of course, you are from the Pasadena area and your family's from the Pasadena area. And you have lots of friends and family here. And so, I'm hoping that your family in particular is doing okay these days.
Absolutely. Everyone's back in their neighborhoods and they're busy, working on those remediation projects.
Mhm.
I think I know Caltech has done a lot in terms of just like public facing science, like understanding wildfires, understanding building resilient communities. It seems like never before has Southern California really united around a campaign to figure out how to mitigate this kind of, risk in the future.
Well, and you also just again experienced these natural disaster just last week when a tornado literally tore through your neighborhood. And again, I'm sorry to hear that. And it sounds like you all are doing okay in the aftermath of that disaster as well.
Thanks. Yep.
So let's talk about the January conference. So if you're interested in your listening, either live or on the podcast or YouTube, you can visit the conference website on our Caltech Election Integrity Project at protectingtheelection.us, where the agenda, the slide presentations, and links to our YouTube channel, where the videos from the conference are all archived. They're all there, all the materials there, and it's an incredible archive of material. One of the things that we discovered by moving the conference online are a couple of kind of silver linings. One was that it was just remarkable that everybody just was willing to chip in. I was just blown away by the fact that not a single person backed out. Everyone jumped, in to help. And we really had a remarkable event. We also had about 300 people join us online, which was, again, another silver lining. What were your primary takeaways from the conference?
So, you know, I think that there are three that came out of that January conference. Just the first was the enormous amount of interest. There is this recognition that elections are critical to democratic governance, and we need to do what we can to protect them, to make sure that they work. And so I think what we're seeing is just like the reservoir of people who are committed to making evidence-based changes in this space to make sure that we can build the best policy and build the best government we can. So I think those 300 participants are a real sign of our community showing up, whether those are practitioners or policymakers or academics, to try to grow together. And I think it's also a real testament to the Caltech Voting Technology Project, that there is this community that exists that really trusts the science behind this work, that knows that this is nonpartisan science that is really committed to just building the technology that this community needs to build evidence-based policy. And so I think people are really relieved to be in a space that's relatively apolitical,
Mhm.
and is pretty grounded in science. The second thing I would say is just the depth of the need. In preparing for today, I looked up a statistic from the National Conference of State Legislatures, that was surveying their members was trying to figure out, what are the barriers right now for things like AI adoption for different states. And they came back and said about a third of their members are reporting they just don't have the technology infrastructure to be able to use AI. I think what we heard in that conference that we held in January is just the enormous number of people who recognize that because of the preponderance of misinformation, because of bad actors in social media space, the citizen demand for hearing from their policy leaders, from their county officials, has just skyrocketed.
Mhm.
And that increasingly elected officials and county officials, they know there's that need. And they know that that window for elections has gotten a lot wider in terms of having so much early voting. And so that the size of the problem has grown. And so they need some solutions to appropriately size with this problem. And so it feels to me that like we're at again this point, as when the Caltech MIT voting technology project just started, to recognizing that like we are now at this moment of intersection where we need to provide a technological solution to a growing problem that just people were willing to come for 2 or 3 days in January to try to solve because they really feel that is pressing.
Mhm.
And the third thing I just wanted to flag was just like the extremely high quality research that's coming out of students
Mhm.
right now. So I thought we just saw some extraordinary graduate student presentations.
Right.
And that gives me a lot of hope for where this field is going. Like some of those best ideas out there were coming from students who were giving very short poster presentations, but were coming up with really practical and deep ideas. So,
Mhm.
those were, I think, my three key takeaways. But what were yours? What would you say were your three key?
Well, over my, I'd agree with everything you said. I thought that what really struck me first off was the amazing state of research, just generally speaking, in this area of elections and election information and misinformation broadly, just across the board. And we saw it earlier because we'd open up a call for papers. And, honestly, I think you and I were expecting like, friends and family kind of response, right? That we get like 10 people who know
Yeah,
us, right?
10. Yeah.
And we had this overwhelming response. We literally had to scramble because we were planning on really just having, in-person short presentations. We had so many incredible people present or propose papers that, we had to move around the program and set up a panel and set up poster sessions and really try to accommodate the incredible amount of research. And I agree with you that I think it really bodes well for this field because, like me, you've been around since this area of kind of what we now call election science started. The second thing that I was really struck by too, though, was just the level of interaction and interest in communicating and collaborating that exists between what we'd call, say, the stakeholders, the election officials, and the people who work as practitioners in the area and the research community. Again, 25, 30 years ago, that was really unheard of. You very rarely saw election officials who collaborated directly with academics. And academics, I think we're in our little ivory towers at that time. And I think we've stepped away from the ivory towers, and I think the election officials are really, really accommodating and really interested in working with us. And that spirit was just, I think, even though we weren't in person, that spirit was there. And I think there was a really interesting a lot of energy, around the idea of building collaborations, which takes me to the next question, which is, when we were sitting there listening to all this, I think it was you who came up with the idea of, well, we need to have another conference. I
We
think
absolutely do.
you're like chatting on Slack or something, and you're like, well, we need to follow up with this. So tell us about the follow-up event that's going to happen at WashU in October.
All right. I'm going to put the link in the chat.
Okay, perfect. Thank
All
you.
right, no, I didn't do it
No, you
correctly.
did. It's there.
To press everyone. There we go. Um, all right. So after this meeting, I thought we need to keep this momentum going. I actually think that it is incredibly important for universities to take time to work on the most pressing problems of our age. And I think that's one of the ways in which We do our very best by our students as we put them out to the frontier of the questions of our age and we say, let's collaborate and solve these problems. I also think that, when you're thinking about the kinds of research projects that you're going to work on, when you have people who are coming in and saying, like, we're stuck, like, we're a great community to work on these things because we are nonpartisan. And so I think coming to a community of scientists and saying we're stuck on this issue is a great place to come, because we're also not coming with a business plan. We're not coming back and saying, oh, we're going to make a little money, or we're going to, like, we're just coming back with the science. And so it makes this really great opportunity to serve ordinary citizens, because we're not coming with an angle or a pitch. We're just coming in with the science.
Mhm.
And I think that makes these really exceptional collaborations. I also think what we heard from the election officials was just this huge need. And so it seemed like what we needed to do was to push especially into the space of AI and governance. I think we're seeing a lot of different areas and different voices come out of this space. Microsoft just came out with a push to say, listen, generative AI can actually really work on these problems of governance, that it's possible here that these tools could come up with more effective and more inclusive and more responsive government if used to their best advantage. And I think that is probably true, but then someone has to mitigate that for public officials to say, well, what is the right way to use those tools? In March of 2024, which now seems like so long ago, the Office of Management and Budget actually came out with a federal directive to say, listen, all executive departments and agencies, see what you can do in terms of using AI to streamline operations and reduce costs and improve efficiency. And that's something all taxpayers want to do, but someone has to explain how to do it.
Mhm.
And so I thought this is an opportunity for the academic community to reconvene with the practitioner community, and with an elected official community, and say, how can we collaborate? And so for 2 days in October, I think we will really have a chance to work together.
Mhm.
And I think this is both for a chance to people to explain problems, to make pitches for problems that they need help with, and for academics to say, here's where we think the state of the science is.
Mhm.
And then not only can we hopefully find some solutions, but we can also find some new problems to work on. And so we can continue that conversation. And I thought some of the work that came out of that first conference, especially some of your work that has been happening in Orange County, has just been really important in terms of meeting the needs of our age. And I
Mhm.
think that's really where academics do their best work.
Great. And so for those of you who may not be on with us live, I'll just read the URL out. It'll be posted pretty widely on social media and various places after we are done with this, but it's https://POLI-SCI.WUSTL.edu/protecting-election-governance-conference. So pretty straightforward, https://poli-sci-washu.edu, Protecting Election AI Governance Conference.
Thanks. And this is a 2-day in-person research conference and practitioner conference that'll be held at WashU from October 16th to 17th in 2025. And we'll discuss research on AI and governance, and how this applies to US elections.
Great. And do you have any teasers for some of the guests that are already lined up?
We have 2 already. So former Washington Secretary of State Kim Wyman, senior fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center, will be joining us, which is very exciting. And I understand will be your next guest on the Election Science Office Hours coming up on June 11th. But also, a woman who has come to WashU once before, who's a real superstar, Brianna Lennon, who's the county clerk in Boone County, Missouri. And she's also the co-host of the High Turnout Wide Margins podcast. She's planning to speak.
Mhm.
She's come to WashU once before, where she gave a big lecture to a group of women who were interested in running for public office and explained every detail. What are the filing deadlines? How do you get the right number of signatures? How do you verify the signatures? How do you make sure everything is legal? It was just an extraordinary moment here. And so I think we're really lucky to have these 2 superstars, coming to our meeting. And I'm really excited to see what they have to say.
Yeah, it's super exciting. And I'll have to say in chat, Kim Wyman is actually with us live today, and she just wrote that she's so excited to be part of office hours and the conference. So thank you, Kim. We're really looking forward to seeing you on office hours, but also seeing you at this conference in October. It's going to be an exciting event. So let's talk a little bit, see, one of the things you mentioned was bringing the stakeholders together to talk about their needs and to have researchers talk about the things that they're building to try to help solve those needs. So the research that we've been doing jointly with Mitchell Liniger, who's a PhD student here at Caltech, and Sander Bender Linden, who's a professor at the University of Cambridge, has really been, I think, smack dab in that area. So can you talk a little bit, about the need that you think we're trying to solve with the research we're doing and what we're doing?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm going to talk about my research first, and then I'm going to talk about some of these broader questions. I think there's a really interesting question to think about. We know my research has shown for a long time, but lots of other people's research has shown for a long time that social information is really powerful. That is, information delivered from a trusted source. And we've never known if it was the information itself, or it was simply peer influence, or if it was the modality by which the information was delivered. I used the right vernacular, or I emphasized the right topics, or I framed it in just the right way so the listener understood. But we know this kind of social influence, it persuades people to change their mind about things in politics, which is rare. It also has tremendous impact on mobilization. And one of the things that generative AI can do, especially through chatbots, is it can mimic that information. So it can mimic that delivery. And all of a sudden, with the evolution of chatbots, everything changes. So what if you don't need a human to deliver that social information? You can just mimic it. What will happen? And so we've seen an emerging body of research established here to say, all right, well, it does appear that this is a really effective strategy for mitigating misinformation. Can it also be used to increase trust in governance? And so in our research, we've broken this out into two distinct components so far, and I'm hoping it will grow. The first is just to look at, can we increase trust in elections by using snippets of text that are generated through generative AI, and to prime them for people to see if they respond, to see how they can do. Can those protect them against essentially the future exposures to misinformation? And we find they're very effective. And so, that project is now under review. And so then we amplified it a little bit more. So then we said, well, let's do something even bigger. So then we said, all right, instead of just putting that little bit of text from the AI models, from these large language models, in to see if people respond to them differently or not, as they otherwise would, let's actually let people talk to the chatbot itself to have a little bit of that mirrored conversation. And this means that if you want to ask the chatbot a question that's a little bit off topic, or you might be a little embarrassed to say, are you sure that's true? Can you find me a source? You can sort of reveal to an anonymous chatbot things you might not be comfortable even revealing to a good friend. And what we find is actually this intervention is effective, like not only immediately, but that effect endures for a period of time as well. And that's pretty exciting. I think the space of this kind of intervention, that it can actually fight against the presence of misinformation, it can inoculate people against the presence of misinformation and increase trust in government, is a really cool thing to do. And I keep thinking about how, over and over again, what we're seeing is in that election window, in the wind up to elections, where county election officials are being bombarded with questions about how voters can vote, or where voters can vote, or exactly how certain ballots get cast in different times. And all of this information is available on most websites, but it's sort of this complicated multiple choice test where you have to figure out, oh, I have to click on this link and then this link and then this link, and I have to follow this choose your own adventure chain to find my answer. Or I have to pester the county by calling them on the phone and having a long wait time. Well, what if you could do that via chatbot? So I think one of the ways in which I'm hoping our research will accelerate into the future even further is helping provide that really bespoke and targeted information delivery. This actually lines up with some of the earlier work you and Inez Levin did, where you were helping people figure out in a European system where there are a lot of parties, how can people identify which party they should support in European elections? and giving people a little bit of information about here's a survey you can figure out, and we can sort of map then what your preferences are into what parties are. Well, people love having tools to help them make decisions, especially if those tools are trustworthy. And so I think here, the space for this research where it's going is hopefully helping ordinary citizens have better tools that reduce the cost and the burdens on our government officials to be able to answer some of these questions. And I think we are already seeing that the initial introduction of tools, from just the snippets of text from those generative AI models to the chatbots themselves, are actually really effective. And so I think it gives me a lot of hope for where this research project in general is going. We're actually gonna be able to build really cool tools and demonstrate their efficacy. And one of the important things about partnering with academics is we test things. And so we always test things against a counterfactual, like what if you didn't have a human in the loop? Or what if you didn't have a control case that didn't get exposed to this tool? So you can say, well, suppose you didn't have that, what would have happened then? And that evidence then lets you be able to trust that kind of science. I also think it's really important when we think about generative AI tools in the space of protecting people's privacy.
Mhm.
So one of the things I've done in this current role, and we've done really thoughtfully at WashU, is to try to build out endpoints to use generative AI that protect the information that people put into it, so it doesn't get sent back to be trained in future iterations. And I think having endpoints that are both HIPAA and FERPA compliant for people to be able to use to protect their privacy is an extremely important component of what we're doing.
Yeah, that having access to that, we call it an endpoint, but basically having access to a language model that
Yeah.
WashU provides that is HIPAA and FERPA compliant, other words for us IRB compliant, right, has been an incredibly valuable addition to the research that we've been able to do. And I think that it's a best practice that I think lots of other universities are starting to think about. And hopefully, I know we're planning on trying to write a little bit about that at some point in the near future. So what I'm wondering is like, let's try to connect some dots here. So the chatbot and the AI assisted approach and the research that we've been doing, we can show that it does help reduce people's the credibility that they may place on a particular rumor, and it can also, in the short term, increase their confidence in the election process. But if the use case is, say, an election official using a chatbot like this, how do you make the technology a trusted source? I mean, again, so the thing about calling somebody or actually driving to your county election official's office and walking in is you actually encounter a person in an office who it works for the county or works for the state, and you should be able to trust them. How do we make the technology trustworthy?
I mean, I think these are really important conversations to be having as an academic community, because I think an ongoing barrier for AI adoption is either an unclear ethical framework that partners have, or an unclear governance framework. And I think both of those things come into play. I think it's incredibly important to protect people's privacy. And so
Mhm.
I think, not every generative AI model is going to be able to do that. So I think this is a good space for universities to intervene. I also think it's important to have humans in the loop. We've talked about that a lot. To think about like putting up guardrails against hallucinations, to think about monitoring the content of information that's coming through. I would also say that I think it's also important to think about what the risks are of not doing these things.
Mhm.
And so I think, it's not the case, like, it would be really great if your county election officials could answer 3,000 phone calls a day, and meet everyone's needs. But the reality is that with this wave of bad actors, we're seeing, so many tests happening day after day across our social media platforms, where people are trying deliberately to
Mhm.
to mess up confidence in elections. And so the risk of not adopting some of these technologies is we let those bad actors be really loud and the good actors don't get time to speak because they can never create enough human resources to meet the need right now.
Mhm.
And so I think that counterfactual of thinking about like what is at risk here, what's at risk is that we let someone be convinced by, a bad bot online and we don't try to build the good bot
Mhm.
to fight back. And so I think that's really, in my opinion, like the fundamental ethical quandary here is we have the technology, we're still developing it, but the risk for not using it is pretty huge in terms of losing the trust of the American voter.
Mhm. Well, as you, I think, pointed out to me a number of times, we're in something of an arms race, right? Against the bad actors or in those, not, they're all around, and particularly the ones I worry a lot about are, other governments intervening in our elections, and they do have obviously vast resources to use AI to, influence our electoral process. Do those concerns kind of, I know there's a lot on your mind, you've got all these jobs, but in the, kind of metaphorical sense, those kind of concerns keep you up at night that the technology, especially AI, is going to have some serious negative consequences for elections and in particular for democracy?
Yes. I think what we've seen is that AI is really persuasive. So, in the recent Reddit experiment, which has been covered by The Atlantic, what we've seen is that, so in this experiment, a group of universities, or a group of researchers, who have not yet been officially named, engaged in an experiment on Reddit where they used a large language model to generate comments that were specifically targeted at a Redditor's demographics. So they collected so many of the characteristics of the Redditor and then responded with really bespoke information and then tracked to see if those comments that they embedded were more liked than comments generated by other humans, assuming the other Redditors were humans. And what they found is this was really effective. And it seemed to be actually like, really the kind of comment that people responded to very ardently. And then when it was revealed to the other Redditors that in fact these had not been human generated comments, there was this real outpouring of anger
Mhm.
that someone had been experimenting in this space where there was this assumption that it was human to human conversation, that it wasn't automated. But I think what we see is like, AI is able to provide that highly personalized content that makes people feel seen and heard. And in these kinds of deep persuasion experiments that have happened, where people go door to door knocking and
Mhm.
talk for a few minutes to try to persuade people to change their minds about a political issue, time and time again, the theme of that isn't that you need to appeal to high values. You actually need to find common ground. And the moment that you find common ground, people are willing to move a little bit. And so if algorithmically there's some process by which the algorithm can persuade, and we only have bad actors doing that in this space, then we've lost. And so we need people with the courage to try to go out and be real scientific inventors here and try to test out tools here to fight on the part of good.
Mhm.
And I think I worry about that a lot, that we will sometimes see only the risk in this space and not the reward or the opportunity, that to have those conversations that we know we need to have, but we can't have at scale right now.
Mhm.
I think it's not just that there are other bad actors. I also think it's just dealing with the reality of resource constraints that's
Mhm.
sometimes very hard to see. And so it's like, would we rather have a best friend call each of us? Yes. Do we have the resources to do that? No. And we're seeing places emerge like that. So the Department of Veteran Affairs right now actually is using AI to analyze their medical records and their data to try to predict risk-related incidents of suicide because they know that they just don't have enough staff to get through all of those records in time. And they feel pretty committed to doing what they can, even if it's that they're going to not always pick up the right people, at least they're going to try to reach out where they need to. And the risk of not reaching out is pretty enormous. And I
Mhm.
think the risk of not reaching out and not doing this around elections and democracy is huge. And so we
Yeah.
have to do something.
Yeah, I was one of the presentations at our conference in January by Stephen Lewandowski, just really struck me in this way. He's published some work on what they call the micro-targeting manipulation machine. Which again is very similar to what we think went on with this Reddit research, but done in an ethically correct manner. But very powerful, where they can show that the technology can basically target messages that are kind of akin to someone's own personality, and use those in ways that are very persuasive. And so the technology, as many people keep pointing out to me, can be used for good. It can not be used for other purposes. But as researchers, I think you've been really fantastic at articulating this, that we do need to try to at least catch up, if not try to stay ahead. And it's not like we can bury our heads in the sand and just pretend that the technology is not changing elections. We have to stay up on top of this, and again, try to get ahead of it and make sure that we can figure out how to use it for good. So what other things are you doing in this area, in particular with language models and AI? How are you using it in your other research or other kinds of research projects on AI and language models?
So I suppose I want to talk about my vice provost role there for just a minute, because I think that's the space where I've been trying to think about how we can use our university's resources, especially in the space of AI, to do a whole range of other things. And one has to do with just reducing barriers to government use. And so I bet that you've probably at one point in time had to figure out how to fill out an online form to request a birth certificate, or other kinds of vital records. And one of the things that we've been thinking a lot about here at WashU has been trying to think about, could we build technology to just help people do that a little bit faster? Like, what if there were a whole host of government forms that you needed to fill out? Could we build a chatbot that kept your information safe but helped you fill out those forms? Because sometimes that's what you need to be able to, whether it's to fill out a bail certificate, to apply for a job, like the barriers to just accessing these different websites, these different kinds of vital records. That's the kind of technology that we should be able to build that makes government more accessible for all. And I think, especially as we see things like, how do you register to vote? How do you have to register to vote if you have to have these kinds of vital records?
Right.
Like, there's a lot of potential there to grow into these spaces. And some of those tools could actually do a lot to reduce inequality. So I think there's a lot that we could do. I keep coming back to this idea that we're at this really exciting moment in a scientific community where we've got this generative AI tool out there, and we know that it can do amazing things, and we just haven't figured out why. And so one of my favorite stories to talk about is actually the discovery of the barometer. So if you go way back in history, Evangelista Torricelli in 1644 not only invented the first vacuum, but he put a little mercury in a glass tube, and lo and behold, he invented the first barometer. He could measure air. And he says, look, I hypothesize we live in a sea of air. And of course, like, the barometer is itself the only reason, in my opinion, this is so exciting, is it lets you see the future. So like, all of a sudden, is it going to rain? Which is a question that people desperately wanted the answer to. And now they could see into the future. And I feel like with most of these generative AI models, what we have right now is we have the barometer, but no one has figured out how to use this thing to see into the future yet. They don't know what they could do to actually try to predict, is it going to rain? And so I think some of the spaces here that we're going to see really exciting interventions is trying to use these tools to try to look at the sea of data all around us and make sense of it. And so some of the other projects that I'm like sort of distantly related to have been trying to think about, like, what if you could see all the data in a city? Like, what would emerge if you could apply some of these like algorithms to discovery to try to say, oh, I see something interesting between traffic patterns and green space, or asthma and the presence of neighboring schools. Like, that we could see things that we didn't otherwise see emerging out of these different spaces. And
Mhm.
so I basically feel like we're just at this moment where we have invented this technological tool, but we haven't figured out yet how to use it to see into our future.
I'm with you on that. Like you, teach graduate methods, and I've been teaching that this quarter. And we talked yesterday about just all of again, just this vast ocean of data that we're just surrounded by, and it's incredible the amount of data that's just generated daily. Like back when I was in grad school, which is a long, long time ago, back in the era before the internet, or it was just sort of being invented at that time. you know, we worried about data being generated like every election cycle, right? And now it's like it's generated daily. Petabytes of data are being generated just all around us, and it's amazing. And that we don't really have tools yet to analyze it. And I get the feeling it's like there's something in the air, right? It's kind of like electricity around us right now, and we know things are changing. We don't really know how or why, but we're at a moment like this inflection point where I'm just really excited, right? For the kind of work that and also you talked earlier about graduate students and postdocs, right? These incredibly bright young people who are now, coming into our offices. They're just amazing in their technical skills and things they can do. I think we're on the verge of some sort of, series of revolutions, right, in our discipline. And I'm very, very excited for the future. I can tell you are too. So preaching to the choir. So is there anything really exciting that you've got planned in terms of research or again, initiatives that you've got planned with your really exciting new job over the next couple of years?
Well, this summer so when I first met Mike through the surf program at Caltech. So if anyone has two nickels to rub together on this call, you should donate to the Caltech surf program. It launched like myself, my sister, my little brother, all into our academic careers. Pretty exceptional program that funds summer undergraduate research,
Mhm.
gets students up to that frontier. So echoing that program, we have started here at WashU a summer digital transformation core, where we have students working on teams with this multi-layered mentorship model, where we have faculty mentors and staff mentors and members of the WashU IT community and people from the library who have really joined up in this like Avengers style team to approach 9 different projects from all around campus, with the aim of really accelerating them, to make them sparkle and come alive, to do that kind of translational work that I think helps people understand what it is universities actually do,
Mhm.
but also helps the researchers, get their research done well. And so that's what we're embedded in right now. We just launched that yesterday. And
Wow.
I had that sense of I was back at the Caltech surf program, 20 years later. Um, I think that one of the things that is really going to be like, there's some really big questions out there for universities to think about. How do we do high performance computing? Are we doing it in the cloud now? Do we think about, the ways in which we program jobs for AI specifically? Uh,
Mhm.
do we think about uh, how we think about storing data and the navigation for our privacy? How do we
Mhm.
think about using some of these large language models? Can we build one of our own?
Mhm.
So those are the things I think, we're going to be working on pretty thoughtfully at WashU. I'm really excited about this conference. So I really want people to come both with problems and solutions. I think sometimes the problems are the most interesting thing, or at least people willing to try and do some experimentation. I feel like this is a really great opportunity. We're also at this inflection point as a country where we're seeing, what's been true for the last 80 years has been this federal funding model that has driven how universities do research, and that is changing. And so I think as we see this business model change, we need to really think about how it is that we engage with a broader community of partners. And I think this conference is a great example of how we can do that. I think the most exciting thing I'm going to do this fall is hold this conference on AI and governance with you. I'm pretty.
And I think the most exciting thing I'm going to do this fall is help you and attend. I'm with you. I'm really excited about this. So, just as another plug, that this will be broadcast all over social media. and on various websites. But if people who are watching this or listening to this need information about how to apply, and you can't find it, just send me an email. I'm easy to find. rma@caltech.edu. Is there 50 minutes? Can you believe that? It seems like we just started. We could go for another 50 easily, maybe a couple of more, but is there anything else you'd like to mention that or discuss that we haven't talked about?
I think the thing I want to flag, I suppose, is just that we have a set of pretty exceptional PhD students that we're working with. Mitchell Liniger is a great example. Danny Ebanks, another great example. Many of these students will be in the academic job market soon. And so for those of you who are following and listening, you know, when you have job openings, we can say wonderful things about some of these students. They've been incredible partners to make this research happen.
Right. Well, with that, I want to thank you, Betsy.
Thanks.
It's been great, and you know we'll be seeing each other quite a bit, and I'm really excited about organizing this conference. I wanted to thank the folks who joined us today live, and you know, again, the recording of this will be on the YouTube channel of the Caltech Lynn Center this afternoon. So thanks again, Betsy. Take care, and I hope your recovery from that awful tornado continues to go well.
Thanks.
All right, thank you.